Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is October 11th, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host. If you have questions or comments for Helga, you can send them to us, email them to questions@schillerinstitute.org, or post them in the YouTube chat room. Now, Helga, last week you warned of the growing danger facing the world with the commitment of advocates of the US-NATO unipolar order to escalate the war against Russia and Ukraine. Following the ouster of Speaker McCarthy in the House, which put in jeopardy some of the Ukraine funding, there are some who are now calling for as much as $100 billion additional funds for Ukraine. And now we have a potentially worsening crisis in Southwest Asia, with Israel committed to what they are calling a complete siege against Hamas in Gaza, which will also affect the Palestinian population there. Netanyahu has called for, quote, mighty vengeance, unquote. And the U.S. has sent a carrier strike group, the USS Gerald Ford, to the Eastern Mediterranean. And Defense Secretary Austin announced that they may send another one, the USS Eisenhower carrier group, later on in the situation. And Biden has called for full support for Israel in this. Now, in this context, the Schiller Institute has issued a call to action. No more money for arms in Ukraine, no world war with Russia and China. So given this conjuncture, it's obvious that the opposition to the war hawks must become more visible and more vocal. What's your assessment of how close we are now to a full-scale World War III?
Well, I think that the developments in Southwest Asia since last Saturday clearly have added one full dimension to this danger. I mean, what is unfolding in the so-called Middle East is a complete tragedy, and it is the developments which started 75 years ago, and ever since you have one step after the other on top of each other. Injustices have been committed. The situation which now erupted in the Gaza obviously has been going on for a very long time, and there are many questions which are completely unanswered. There are those who say that it is impossible that Israel, with its absolute impeccable intelligence service, should not have noticed this preparation by the Hamas. I cannot judge that. There are so many factors which I think need to be evaluated very carefully, but it is very clearly the case that you have now an eruption of a very complicated, very complex situation, which does have the potential alone, even without the Ukraine situation, to lead to World War III. The accusation coming from the Wall Street Journal, for example, and others, that Iran would have backed Hamas. I think that other people who are very knowledgeable about the situation on the ground clearly defy that and say this is absolutely not the case. But Netanyahu has made statements in this direction. If it would come to an escalation, which would involve all the different groupings in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and eventually Iran and Israel would get involved in a war which, the unthinkable could happen, that would be the path to World War III. There is no question about it. The plight of the people now is unbelievable. I mean, on both sides, obviously. But what is happening now is the population in the Gaza, the head of the spokesman for the IDF has called on people to leave to Egypt via the only open gate in the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. But that is being bombarded. So what should people do? The UN Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the idea of completely making a blockade, cutting off the population in the Gaza Strip of electricity, water, food, and other life urgent necessities is a clear violation of international law. And it is collective punishment, which is illegal completely because it punishes civilians. Now, naturally, once you get into a long situation of injustice, cruelties happen on all sides. And the danger now is that a very bloody conflict will play out with the potential of going beyond the region, leading to a world. Because if it involves Iran, I think we are off the charts. So, I can only say it's a complete tragedy. It must be stopped right away. And I think it is very important to differentiate now between those people who say there must be an immediate stop to the fighting, whatever the terrible situation is, it must be solved through diplomacy. And those who say, no, we stand by the side of Israel no matter what. Well, on the first category, that's emphatically Russia and China, who have called for calm, to return to the negotiation table. And naturally, it's all the leaders of the so-called West, including Biden, Scholz, Macron, Meloni, various others, who are saying, no, there must be unilateral support for Israel. But, that's not so self-evident. You can be for Israel, but what is Israel? If you look at all the leading papers today, they all call for the resignation of Netanyahu. They call for basically the opposition to rise. Netanyahu is calling for an emergency government of all parties, but it is extremely doubtful that all these parties want to do that, given the fact that the record of Netanyahu in the recent period has been one of, incredible internal strife. So being for Israel does not necessarily mean that you are for the present government, which may be ousted in a short period of time. It's very, very difficult to say. So I think if you look at the situation as such, maybe there are people who are such super duper experts that they can say exactly what is the solution for the Middle East. I can only say that if you look at the strategic situation as a totality, and that includes what's going on inside the United States, what's going on with Ukraine, the proxy war between the US and Russia over Ukraine, the now the new situation in Southwest Asia, the tensions in other places, like, for example, the pending crisis between the United States and global NATO and China over Taiwan, we are sitting on such a powder keg internationally that I think the only reasonable approach must be that all forces who are for peace agree that we need a completely new paradigm of international relations. That within this old order, which is, terrible and many things have gone wrong since decades, there is no solution. That is why my call of now more than, I think, a year ago, to have a new security and development architecture, which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. And that really means every single country and not just some. And it means that there can be only peace through development. Only if you change this present system, which increases the gap between rich and poor, and replace it with a new credit system, which allows for the development of every single state to overcome the terrible conditions in which many peoples of the world are living in. Only then do you have a chance to have peace. Now, I think that, that there must be a discussion about such a new security and development architecture. I think a reference point can be the Peace of Westphalia, which indeed developed this principle that a peace must always take into account the interest of the other. This is the most important principle. And if somebody says, I only take care of the interest of the one side, you preclude the possibility of peace. And all the people who are so self-righteously now claiming that they know what to do should reflect upon that principle, because if you don't take the interest of the other into account, there will be never peace. And I think that, there is some hope. So I'm not saying that the situation is all bleak, even so it is very, very dangerous. But I think the hope is, for example, reflected in the new white paper, which China just published on the 10-year anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. And, I'm sure that this will be more prominently discussed at the Belt and Road Forum, which will start next week. It will obviously discuss the tremendous potential which lies in the idea of a community of a shared future of all of mankind based on development. And so there is a framework of resolving all of this. It would require, however, that unilateralism stops, that block building stops, and that we accept the idea that the so-called West must cooperate with the countries of the global South and completely change the axioms of their thinking. Now, I don't know if that's possible. You see, the problem is that the Western elites have demonstrated in the recent period such an absolute inability to reflect on their mistakes that it is a big question if they are capable and willing to do so. And that makes all the more urgent the need to build an international peace movement which is strong enough that it can be heard, especially by the vast majority of people who, in part are hating the mainstream media. I mean, the disgust of the mainstream media is growing, but, many people feel that they have no other source of information, and many people also feel that there is absolutely nothing they can do. That is not true. One can do something, and we are right now trying to unite the peace movement internationally to become stronger and move to a completely different order of things where the interest of humanity, of all of us, is being put first, and then only comes the national interest. So these are some of my reflections on a very grave and very dangerous situation.
We just heard the opening statement from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. If you have questions or comments for her, you can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. And I mentioned this call to action from the Schiller Institute. It's up on the website now. No more money for arms in Ukraine, no world war with Russia and China. Now, we have a number of questions for you, Helga, that come from this deepening of the crisis. Let me start with one. I spoke to a journalist from Southwest Asia today who raised the question of, who said the Israeli strikes on Gaza threaten to create a deeper humanitarian crisis, which you mentioned, the cutting off of water, food, and medication. And he mentioned that Egypt is calling for a settlement, so are some of the other countries in the region, but that pressure is being put on them, especially since Egypt and Saudi Arabia have both become new members of the BRICS. And so he said, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but doesn't this crisis put the BRICS under pressure to realign with the West?
Well, I don't think, that is not possible under the present conditions, because the West is insisting on what they call the rules-based order, which is basically the idea that they are right and the others are wrong, and that they are superior and that their rules are good and everybody else has wrong ideas. And that arrogance and supremacy, claim will not work. I think if you think about what happened in the last several months, you had the spectacular intervention by China, bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia together, and they started to exchange diplomats. They started to talk to each other. And this was on the road of solving the conflict between the Shiites and the Sunnis in the region, which had effects on many other countries. Then a little bit later came the idea that Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Egypt are all becoming parts of the BRICS. This is supposed to start on the 1st of next year. And obviously that would lay the foundation to solve all problems, because if you have a rapprochement among the major strains of religion and economic development, as it only can come through the joint cooperation on the projects of the Belt and Road Initiative, the situation looked extremely bright. But then there was very clearly the effort, to keep the so-called democracies, building an alliance against the so-called dictatorships, which is a construct completely, because who is a dictatorship and who is a democracy remains to be debated, because if you look at the actual conditions, it gives you a very different picture. But there was a clear effort by the Biden administration in particular to forge a rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And there are several voices basically saying that for the Hamas, this was getting unacceptable because it left the Palestinian question completely out of the picture. But that was only maybe the last final trigger of a long endured situation, because there is actually the people who characterize the situation in the Gaza Strip, as an open air prison, and that was what it was. So what triggered this eruption? That requires some more investigation and so forth. But it was definitely something which had to happen, because you cannot, it's like what the Declaration of Independence says: a people can endure an unjust situation for a very long time, but there comes a point where it becomes unbearable. And was it just that it became unbearable because of this Israeli-Saudi rapprochement, or was there some other reason triggering it now, where it was clearly for months, if not longer, in preparation? These are all questions I cannot answer. But what is a fact is that the solution, how to get out of it, I'm afraid this will play out for some hopefully short time, causing many more people to die, but it must be settled as quickly as possible. There must be a complete intervention. Anybody who has any influence there, like, for example, Erdogan and others, must absolutely bring their weight in to stop this bloodshed, because it kills too many people, and it is absolutely intolerable. And once you get into a spiral of such things, it becomes worse, because then there is another revenge and another revenge, and that vicious cycle must be interrupted, and real economic development must be put in its place. So is there a hope to change it? Well, I would think so, but I think the solution can only come from the global south, that the BRICS and the other countries of the global south become stronger. They are the majority of the world, and that the people in the West change their government policies, because it is not the global south which has been wrong. It has been the global north and the global west who failed the world situation, actually since 600 years, since the beginning of colonialism.
Well, that leads into the next two questions, which I'm going to include together. We have a question. Someone wrote, Putin gave an interesting picture of the strategic situation in his address to the Valdai Club. Did you read it? And if so, can you comment on what he said? And then there was a second comment. Someone wrote in and said, I heard that Putin denounced neo-colonialism, corporate oligarchy, and Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. What does that say about those conspiracy theorists who say that Putin and Russia and China are all in on the Great Reset and new globalist world order? So let's start with Putin at the Valdai Club.
Well, I think the idea that Putin is in with the World Economic Forum is just absurd. I think I would really advise everybody to read the speech by Putin, which is very long, but it gives you a very differentiated picture. And apart from all the, anti-Russian, bias and propaganda, what comes across is an extremely rational, calm person who, is very clear-sighted and who has a very clear perspective for the world where it should go. I think the most impressive for me was, apart from the fact that he again gave a story about how the Ukraine war developed, quite detailed, so people should really read that, because the war did not start on the 24th of February 22. So that part was extremely important. But I think what impressed me the most was his discussion about the absolute right of all cultures to develop on the basis of their own tradition and identity. The multipolarity of the world's system, that it is completely illegitimate and not permissible that one country or a group of countries impose their ideas of how the world should be on another group of people, but that the tradition of cultures as they have grown have the right to unfold in their own way. And I think that's a very important principle, because if you think about the different cultures around the world, think about India, think about Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, China, Russia, the Balkan countries, Italy, France, Africa, Latin America. All of these countries are so different, and they bring in so much, each country has at one point or another contributed something important to universal history. So in all their diversity, they also have things which contribute to the progress of universal history as a totality. So I think to have respect for the difference and recognize what is universal is the basis for peace. And I think Putin expressed that in a very profound way. So I can only encourage, don't just listen to the media, read the whole speech. That's an old principle of the humanists, by the way, who always said, go to the sources. And in that case, Putin should be such a source.
I think that's what your husband used to say a lot also. Now, we have a question about the announcement this week by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that he will run as an independent candidate for president. Of course, we've had our own experience with the corruption of the Democratic National Leadership and the DNC, but the questioner asks, what do you think about the Kennedy campaign?
Well, I think it's a lining of hope at the horizon for sure. While I would probably not agree with every particular viewpoint he has said, I think it's such a breath of fresh air in the political scene in the United States, because he clearly evokes the spirit of his uncle, John F. Kennedy, his idea of peace. He clearly reflects also some of the views of his father, and he is also, close to Martin Luther King. And I think Biden is now a big problem, because when Biden and the DNC made the rules of the primaries in such a way that it became clear that no matter how many votes Robert Kennedy would receive, they would not be counted on the basis that the Democratic Party says, oh, we can make the rules of the club, because after all, the Democratic Party is a private club, which is how they argued the stealing of many delegates of my husband in Arkansas during his presidential campaign. And that clearly was a violation of the Voters' Rights Act. And, the Democratic Party now basically clearly indicated that they were willing to go that road as well. But now you look at the percentage of Democratic voters who have said in the polls that they would vote for Kennedy as an independent. I think one poll I saw was even 63% of Democrats voting for Kennedy. I think this is a reason for Biden to get quite a little bit, more reasonable on many points. And one can only hope that, the security of Kennedy is very good, given the history of his family. So, but I think, the blame of if it would happen to him, what happened to his uncle and his father, that would be such a nightmare that I think nobody in the United States in their right mind would wish to go that road, because it would, tear the country apart in a way which probably would not be concealable. So I think it's very hopeful, and I think that the United States can come back to their tradition of a republic. I know that is a very difficult proposition right now, given the fact that the powers to be seem to be so strong. But I don't think that the American spirit of the American Republic, the American Constitution, the American Revolution, which after all was the first war of independence against the colonial system, against the British Empire, I think that tradition can be evoked, and that would change the world to the better so dramatically that I think everything would fall into line, because it would meet a demand by the majority of the countries of the world that the world should be brought into a more just system. So it's very exciting periods, and I can only say, don't sit on the sidelines, become active with us to make sure the world is going in the direction of peace and a new order.
And LaRouche, candidate for Senate in New York, Diane Sayre, issued a very good statement on the importance of the Kennedy campaign. And obviously, the DNC has its own view of it being a rules-based order. But I would point out that its polls show that 2/3 of Democrats wish that Biden wouldn't run. So what you're saying is definitely the case. Now, I have a couple of questions, Helga, that get right at the heart of some philosophical thoughts that I know reflect your thinking, and I want to read them to you. One is from Thomas, who often sends in a question. He asks about the coincidentia oppositorum, and he said, what you're calling for is a higher philosophical approach to solving problems. But he said there's a problem with the present degeneration of culture. Can using such a philosophical principle work, given its complexity and the generally poor quality of thinking in the people? And I want to connect that with a comment from Tony Magliano of Pax Christi, who raises a question of Catholic social teaching emphasizing love, social justice, and peace, respect for all life. Would this be useful in addressing the crisis?
Well, I think absolutely, because it's true that the present Western culture is absolutely degenerate. I think we have a deep cultural crisis, probably worse than at the end of the Roman Empire, because the liberal system, which has gone in the direction of everything goes, everything is allowed for such a long period of time that, you have a real morass of degeneracy. I do not overlook that for 1 second. But fortunately, you have around the world, cultures which have rejected that. I know that people have not the right understanding, or many people don't have the right understanding, but the Chinese idea of a harmonious development of all nations based on the long Confucian tradition has a similar approach. You find similar ideas in many other cultures and religions. And especially, I fully agree with the Augustinian tradition of the Catholic or the Christian faith. I think the idea of agape, of love, is the absolute indispensable ingredient, because only if people return to a love of mankind do we have any hope to solve the many problems we touched upon today. And I think the social teachings of the church, absolutely, because if all the parties who have a C in their name, like the Christian Democrats in Germany, the Christian Social Democrats, if they would follow the demand of the social teachings of the church or the encyclicas of the Pope, we would not be in this crisis. The problem is that they give lip service to these values, but they don't act on that. But I can only say that I have a big hope that if in the present crisis, all the religions would step forward and not, be part of this divide and conquer game, but to actually step beyond the present situation and unite around the question for peace. Absolutely. And, since Thomas mentioned the coincidentia oppositorum, it is a difficult concept. I admit that. But, I think it is one of the most worthwhile efforts to try to understand it. Naturally, Nicolaus of Cruz came to the idea through his theological discussions and reflections, thinking about the multitude of the creation, the diversity of everything, material around us, and the need to look for the one which unites that diversity. And actually, he came to the conclusion that the one, the higher one, is naturally God. And that, only if you think about the idea that man is the living image of God, the imago viva Dei, not just the image of man, imago Dei, but imago viva Dei, the living image of God, which, when man is trying to be like that, he replicates the most noble aspects of the divine, that is the creativity for the common good. So when you think through all of these things, you come to the conclusion that once you have this vis creativa working in you, you can conceptualize always the higher one, that higher level where all the contradictions are falling into one. And that is a method by thinking about God this way. This is in part negative theology, that you don't want to give God a name, like even the name the Almighty or the All-Knowing. These are already limitations, because when you say something concrete like that about God, you already exclude certain things and you project your own human viewpoints. And that is why Nicolaus of Cusa made a big effort to come to a definition of God which was not limited by human projections. For example, one other two extremely important writings is De Visione Dei, about the vision of God, and the De Non Aliud, which is a very challenging paper. But if you read these things, the good thing is that it prevents you from attaching your thoughts to any fixed object. So it's a complete, to read Cusa and to try to understand him is the best weapon against Aristotelianism, because it prevents you from latching on to some easy explanation, and it forces the mind to think this higher level, which is the source of creativity. Any composer of classical music will immediately explain to you that that is required to come up with a composition like Beethoven's symphonies, for example, or the great dramas, because you have to have this idea of the higher one in your mind before you start to even play the first note or write the first word in a drama. So it's a method of thinking. And I agree it is difficult, but I'm also optimistic that it is, that you can conquer it. And, I think that what we need is sort of a council of the wise worldwide, of people who are willing to entertain such a method of thinking to overcome the present contradictions. And, I think some people are showing this already as a quality.
Well, Helga, thank you for that answer and for joining us again today. And we'll be back next week, we hope. Any final words? I should, again, emphasize that people can download the new call to action, the No More Money for Arms in Ukraine, No World War with Russia and China. But anything else you want to add?
Yes, you should contact us, because we are in the process of forming an international peace coalition, which is already joined by, I would say, around 100 organizations and individuals from many parts of the world. And we are trying to build that to become an ever stronger coalition of people who oppose the escalation into World War III. And you should contact us, and then we will include you in this fight, which is very important. So don't sit on the sidelines, become active with us.
Okay, well, thanks, Helga. And again, we'll see you next week.
Till next week.